Welcome back to LokadTV. This week we're joined in Paris by Hervé Hillion, one of the managing partners of SAY Partners. Hervé has over 20 years experience in operations consulting and also the strategic management of complex supply chains. Today we're going to be discussing how you would implement change across the supply chain and also getting his views on how operations can be structured in the future. So Hervé, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks.
Perhaps a nice place to kind of start would be if you could just sort of tell us a bit about your background and tell us a bit more about SAY Partners.
Yes, I have been in the supply chain consulting business for almost 25 years now, and I started up my own consulting company back in the early 90s, at a time when supply chain was hardly known and even the acronym supply chain was not widespread, but I was already in the optimization of flows, as we said at the time. Along my experience, I went to different consulting firms, big consulting firms as well, and I decided to restart my own consulting company 5 years ago, SAY Partners, around digital transformation of supply chain, a bit before digitalization came to be very well known as it is today.
Okay, and Joannès, we sort of spoke a bit about digitalization there. What are the verticals that you're already seeing in the supply chain industry that are a little bit behind in kind of their approach to their supply chain and a little bit sort of old-fashioned, so to speak?
Let's make enemies today.
Yeah.
No, but clearly, I would say again, verticals. When we say verticals, it's very wide. So there is no matter which vertical you pick, you know there is diversity. But and so there is people ahead, people behind. But still, overall, I would say it's very the verticals who were really the pioneer of modern supply chains are now kind of behind. So, for example, food is mostly behind. It's general merchandise is mostly behind. It's interesting because they were part of, I would say, the revolution after the Second World War, where they did invent, mass distribution with hypermarkets, supermarkets, that has pretty much defined our modern way of life, replacing individual stores and very, I would say, traditional supply network that were very informal, very loosely structured and operating mostly at a local scale. But now those supply chains have undergone usually their digital transformation very early. And it's interesting that I see many of those companies that are still a bit stuck with IT systems that were set up in the 80s. And now it is, I would say, for a time they were really ahead of the pack because they were having IT systems while the rest of the economy had not. They were in I would say in the 80s to have already a supply chain that was driven by barcodes, where you had already electronic records for pretty much everything. You were really ahead of the rest of the world. And nowadays, I would say, with all the transformation that have arisen since basically internet, with first bringing things connected through the internet, then to completely industrialize your IT itself with cloud computing, then to consolidate all your data with all the big data technologies, then to exploit them in statistical ways that are much more, I would say, refined with everything that is under the umbrella of machine learning, etc. All those kind of evolution/revolution are piling up, and I see that I would say more traditional verticals are starting to lag behind, I would say, relatively seriously. And so probably yes.
It's very surprising that, because with things like food, there's things like expiry dates and things like that. So what you're sort of saying is that sort of software was implemented back in the 80s and it's just sort of become frozen in time because it already worked. Is that what we're sort of saying?
That's kind of what we observe for, again, it's not just, when I say food, it's more like general merchandise, general retailers that are probably, I would say, a nudge behind what is being done. But again, it's a mix, because even those I would say traditional retail companies are themselves, for example, if we look at Walmart, they have acquired Jet, I think something like 2 years ago. So they have a mix of super aggressive e-commerce retailers that are literally probably state of the art in terms of tech, with ancient systems that are nowadays, I would say, 3 decades old, or maybe sometimes 4.
I would like to add a couple of comments. This is both an important and difficult question. I will make 2 observations. One is that in terms of verticals, we should be also aware and cautious that within a vertical there may be leaders, yes. And there may be companies behind the pack for a number of reasons. I would say both in terms of DNA, culture, governance, and all that. So we need to be cautious when we just talk about verticals. My second observation would be that, as Joannès said, for companies historically that are really confronted to omni-channel e-commerce, necessarily they have been pushed to lead and to be more digitalized sooner than, for instance, pure B2B company. Although now what we see is that the B2C type of ambition in terms of e-commerce, but omni-channel, is propagating very rapidly to B2B as well, and upstream in supply chain. So you see, for instance, other verticals where the companies are not, for the past years, really at the top level in terms of digitalization and all that, like, for instance, chemicals or metals. Yes. But now they are starting to rush to actually fulfill the gap. Okay. With what you see in...
So in order to fulfill this gap, we're going to be introducing probably some new technology.
Yeah.
How do you approach that change when that new technology requires a new skill set, and that they're requiring probably some new resource? Is it something you'd approach with accessing training, or is it something you'd approach more of a side of accessing actually new resource and getting new resource in?
That's a very important question, but I would give 2 answers. First, that's what I have said a number of times. If you use the technology or the today technology like smart data, big data, intelligence and artificial, just to improve the way you do your business or with the current business process, just for instance to have KPI, let's talk about supply chain, more frequent KPI and so on. I think you miss the point because the real challenge is to use the technology to transform your business model and your operating model. And for instance, in supply chain, what will be important as far as I see it is historically supply chain is a vast area of process for planning, forecasting, inventory management, and so on. And for me, one major challenge for leveraging the technology is to shift from a process point of view to a data point of view, what I would call data-driven supply chain, which is really a transformation of the operating model. So that was my first answer, to say it's not only a matter of skills, it's really a matter of also of governance of the way to operate, which is probably the most difficult challenge in terms of change. Then, indeed, there is also the question of competencies and skills. And I would be a bit contrarian here in terms of the evolution of skills. What I mean by that is that we won't necessarily need more and more technical skills tomorrow. My bet, from what I see as well, is that what we would need is more and more soft skills because the technical skills that will be needed will be automated in a way through the new technology, but there are large needs tomorrow for what I would call soft skills, so that where you have people today doing some automated, well, not automated, but some repetitive tasks, surely tomorrow it will be automated, or even some expertise will be automated. But the way you interact with your customers internally, with also the machine, that will be a very different challenge in terms of skill improvement and in terms of training people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about that automation. Uniqlo recently just announced that in one of their warehouses they're replacing 90% of their workforce with full automation. With the advent of things like driverless vehicles, I mean, Joannès, can you see a day when supply chains are almost going to be fully automated?
I mean, again, if we look at 1 century in the past, people 1 century backward would say it's completely incredible. With just one truck driver, you can carry all the harvest of 10 villages. And so probably they would look at us, you know, as saying you had a degree of automation that is just insane, because a handful people can do a harvest that is completely gigantic, and then a few people can carry this harvest to the other side of the continent. Also, with again, when you have cargo ship, you have like a crew of like 6 people who are carrying literally 10 for thousands of tons of merchandise. So I think it's ongoing, and it will continue. So I think but I believe that people have been kind of used to the idea that blue collar jobs are basically getting automated aggressively, and they have been for decades now, and nobody regrets the fact that there is almost no place in supply chain where you need nowadays physical strength. You know, you have pretty much everything where you had to heavy stuff to carry have been pretty much automated. You still have a few jobs where it's really tough physically, but it's literally disappearing fast. But the big change that we're seeing, and that is a tough one, is that when you have white collar automation. And that's something that is a bit new, because I see that in many companies they have shifted from supply chains where you had, let's say, 20 years ago, 90% of people that were on the ground, to a situation where we have clients now where it's kind of 50-50. I mean, you have as many white collars as you have blue collars. Mm-hmm. And what is coming is that, and I agree with the idea of new sort of soft skills, is that if you automate your, let's say, your replenishment, what becomes very strategic is to talk to your suppliers and clients to have more alignment, but that's very different skills. I mean, if basically what you were doing was tweaking all day long Excel sheets, and now this is getting automated, and now the next level of performance will not be gained by better numbers, because, well, relatively automated machinery is taking care of that. And anyway, it's basically pure statistics. There is you can have a better model, but once you have exploited that, now what you have, the next step in terms of performance is probably to have better alignment with your ecosystem, because supply chain is you're taking things in, you need to serve people out, and so it's. But that is a completely. I mean, that's not completely, but that's a very challenging skill set to be able to negotiate with suppliers or clients or other partners, because you also have other partners.
So the interesting thing about that, those white collar roles that are starting to be replaced, is a lot of the time the white collar roles have a bit of political power in a company. We're talking about middle management roles here. We're talking about a bit of political power. So would you take a different approach if you're introducing change to some of these roles?
Well, surely, and I would add some comment to what Joannès just said. I think it's very important that first it's not necessarily replacing a job one-to-one. It's a shift. I'm naturally optimistic, so I don't think it will actually destroy jobs in the long run, but it will change the nature of jobs, actually. And there will still be rooms for, quote, middle management. I think, coming back to supply chain, for two reasons. One, not only for supply chain, by the way. One is the interaction channel are more and more complex. Yesterday, you were not born, but it was with fax and that. Now it's social media. There is an awful lots of different channels to interact, and you cannot only do it automatically. So Joannès took the example of interacting with your suppliers or your client. More and more it would be through lots of different channels. So this is becoming also time consuming to do that, and it cannot be completely fully automated. But it's a shift surely from, exactly as you said, from spending time on Excel spreadsheet and looking at your parameters for inventory management. So that's one major shift, but still you would need some middle management. The other shift is that automated, what is running well is okay, but we all know that today we are more and more in a volatile environment, and a number of disruptions occur. And it's not at all sure today that machine and even AI will be able to actually manage automatically all disruptions. So I'm sure that there will be also a need to manage what is precisely outside the scope of what the machine can do. So that's the reason why there will be shifts in terms of role, in terms of skills, but the jobs will be still there.
We've mentioned a few sort of buzzwords today. We spoke a bit about AI, we spoke about deep learning. There's a lot of buzzwords around sort of the technology industry. Joannès, how do you sort of differentiate between what's a buzzword and what is actually a piece of technology that's here to stay and a piece of technology that's worth kind of investing in?
So interesting thing. I mean, I will start with digression, but fall back on the question is that the buzzwords, there is even you can look at if you use the tool Google Trends, where you can have the statistics on the number of queries on Google on certain keywords. You even have the law of buzzwords, that's, which is the preservation of mass of queries of buzzwords. So if you do the total of cloud computing plus AI plus big data plus machine learning plus blah blah blah, you look at the total number of queries. It's relatively flattish over the year. It's just that you have some buzzword that enter, then so basically it wax and wanes, you know, over the years, and one buzzword takes place of the present. So definitively, just there is to some degree, it's an artifact of I would say the need for novelty of I would say the B2B press, the press in general, and many vendors who need to renew what they have to sell, and so they need a new way to brand it. So there is a fashion, it's basically a fashion effect, but applied to, I would say, the tech sector in general. So what is real is that I believe over the last couple of decades, there has been, I would say, a very steady rate of improvement of pretty much everything. You know, software is improving, hardware is improving, and as far as supply chain is concerned, it's tons of very incremental improvements. RFID, every year RFID are cheaper. RFID works every year a bit better in a noisy environment where you have metal pieces and echo and whatnot. Barcodes are more flexible than ever, and you can have with two-dimensional barcodes, QR code, you can have more information and carry more stuff than ever. The hardware to scan that is cheaper than ever extra. So it's a lot of incremental improvements. And then at some point, what I see is that these mountains of very small incremental improvements, it crystallize something where you basically say, oh, this is machine learning. And then you have all this mountains of improvement that crystallize, and you package the whole thing with a marketing term. Same thing for deep learning. Deep learning is like a collection of 200 numerical tricks packed together or something, and then you can package that. So I believe that the incremental progress is real. The benefit that you can have when you jump from something something that was designed with, let's say, the mindset that you had in the early 2000s from something that you can have at the nowadays, you can observe a big gap. But then the drawback is that because it's a mountain of small increments, it means that if you were already, I would say, quite state of the art, it's not, because if you were, for example, already doing relatively sophisticated machine learning, not deep learning, but just machine learning 2 years ago, you do not expect that you will have like fantastic improvement by going deep learning, which is like an improvement of a previous machine learning model. So that I would say the caveat I would add.
Okay, well, we're going to have to start sort of wrapping things up here, but I'll leave the final word to Hervé. We're seeing some really interesting sort of rapid changes due to technology. How should we be approaching these changes, and where do you see these changes going for the next sort of 50 years?
Well, I have no crystal ball, but maybe we can take some lessons from the past and from the history, because and I mean not too far away, but when we look back at the internet boom and bust in the 2000s, there was lots of hype around. At the time already, e-commerce, digital was not the word, but e-business and all that. And it's funny to see that almost 20 years later, what appears, as you said, to be very new, are old story. Like, for instance, lots of good idea about marketplace and what we call today digitalization. Already, these were ideas back 20 years ago. For instance, in terms of intelligence artificial, I've started my career applying some machine learning algorithm to production facilities. So lots of stuff actually at the time, and algorithm existed as well. What has changed, which is true, is that the technology now to run some of these algorithms are much more efficient, much more powerful. So we need to answer your question. We need to distinguish between what has already existing for a number of years, and this is what you said. Which is very helpful and useful because you can do some incremental evolution and improvement. And we can bet that some of what we said about AR and all that indeed will provide improvement. What is much more difficult is will be really a complete transformation. Which technology will radically transform the supply chain? Let me as a final word give an example or try to do a bet. Today's supply chain, we try to improve and use all the digital technology, but finally, considering that supply chain is still, you have got suppliers, you have got production sites, you have got distribution centers, you have got final customers. But what if tomorrow all this supply chain is no longer how the way it will work? If we took the food to the before or agriculture, more and more you see the development of very local agriculture with people on their buildings, with of course fully automated and with robots being more and more capable of with a very small garden to do some food and all that. So my point is just to say, probably tomorrow, and we don't know how. But supply chain, as we see today, and I don't mean in terms of technology, but in terms of what is supply chain today, will be very different 20 years from now than what it is today.
Okay, well, gents, thank you very much for your time today anyway. It's been really
Thanks a
interesting.
lot for the invitation. Yeah.
So that's everything for this week. We'll be back next week with another episode, but until then, thanks for watching.